The scent of copper and damp wood hung in the air, mingling with the faint tang of chemicals that had sat too long on cracked shelves. A girl crouched over a cluttered workbench, eyes scanning a faded notebook while rain rattled the tin roof above. Outside, a carriage wheel splashed through puddles of Mississippi mud, announcing a visitor who would soon set a chain of events into motion. It was February 7th, 1879, and the air in Jackson felt charged, like the pause before lightning strikes. This girl, 14 years old, was about to defy everything science or society said she could. Why should you care? Because what she uncovered would challenge the boundaries of knowledge, power, and control in a world that refused to name her. Her name was never officially recorded in the laboratory registers. Teachers noted her presence in the margins, her experiments dismissed as juvenile folly. Yet she was already synthesizing compounds that astonished even the seasoned chemists around her. A vial of silver nitrate glimmered under the flicker of a kerosene lamp, evidence of a mind working in secret, untethered from the rules of her era. The neighbors tolerated her work because it was convenient to ignore it. They heard explosions, small, controlled, sometimes terrifying, but attributed them to careless apprentices or the unpredictable nature of chemicals. "A curious child," murmured Mrs. Bell from across the street, "but harmless, I hope." The lesson for the watchers: what remains unobserved can become unstoppable. The girl kept detailed notes in a small, leather-bound journal. She recorded temperatures, observations, and formulas with a precision that startled even the laboratory's director, Dr. Enoch Whitaker. 15 minutes too long in the solution, she wrote, and the compound collapses. Timing is everything. Her handwriting was neat, a grid of certainty in a chaotic world. But the wider society saw only her gender and assumed incapacity. Rain intensified, hammering the roof as if nature itself questioned the ethics of her pursuits. Outside, a pair of boys raced through puddles, indifferent to the flashes of chemical reaction, glowing faintly behind the laboratory window. They left footprints in mud, stepping over broken glass and spilled powders, symbols of a community too distracted by routine to recognize genius when it appeared. What would you do if the most dangerous intelligence you'd ever seen was right in front of you, yet invisible? 3 weeks later, she would submit her first unauthorized report to the state's scientific society. The envelope, sent with trembling hands, contained both calculations and a small sample, a crystal that shimmered like the first frost of winter. She knew that opening it could draw attention, admiration, or dismissal. The act itself was defiance. Not everyone would ignore her brilliance. Dr. Whitaker sensed the stirrings of something extraordinary. He watched from the doorway as she worked, a shadow against the flickering lamplight. "Careful," he whispered. "The world isn't ready for this." But she didn't need the world's readiness. Her curiosity demanded action. She added a few drops of mercury chloride, watching the reaction sizzle. Science had rules, but survival had more. Outside, the clock struck midnight. The tin roof amplified every second, each echo a reminder of how fragile containment could be. If someone interfered, an overseer, a neighbor, a passerby, the consequences could range from exposure to outright catastrophe. And yet she pressed on, confident in her methods, her knowledge, her secrecy. Her hands, small and precise, carried a story older than the laboratory itself, the inheritance of lost generations. Knowledge passed quietly, secretly, in the face of disbelief and control. These hands had learned to move deliberately, to calculate angles and reactions, to survive scrutiny and neglect. She was invisible because society refused to see, yet unstoppable because her mind had no bounds. Her first experiment of consequence would soon reach the wrong eyes. A visitor, drawn by rumors of strange activity in the back streets of Jackson, entered the lab without knocking. He would witness the glittering crystal, the careful measurements, the controlled chaos of brilliance constrained by youth and gender. And in that moment, he would begin a chain of events no one could have predicted. Lightning cracked, illuminating jars of powders that seemed to glow with otherworldly light. One vial toppled, narrowly missing the kerosene lamp. The girl caught it instinctively, heart racing. Every sensation sharpened the smell of ozone, the copper tang, the slick of spilled liquid under her palm. The room held its breath. Outside, the street remained silent, the world indifferent, ignorant of the danger and genius in tandem. Would anyone recognize her, or would she be swallowed by the shadows she navigated so deftly? Her notebook lay open. One page, annotated with precise calculations, hinted at something no one had dared attempt. A compound that could alter perception, invisibly, imperceptibly, without a soul outside the lab knowing. The implications were staggering. If her work survived discovery, it could change medicine, chemistry, even the understanding of human limitation. If it were stolen or misused, the consequences could be catastrophic. And in that charged, copper-scented air, a shadow moved closer to the lab window, a figure drawn by curiosity, profit, or fear. The girl felt the prickle of recognition, that sudden tightening in the stomach that warned of intrusion, betrayal, or both. She tightened her grip on the vial, whispered her secret code into the journal, and prepared to vanish behind the veil of experiment, secrecy, and intellect. The scene froze in tension. Outside, the streets of Jackson were wet and empty. Inside, the future trembled in small hands, poised to leap beyond the boundaries of a world determined to ignore it. Would the girl survive the scrutiny of the world, or would her brilliance be silenced before it could speak? Thunder rolled across Jackson, rattling shutters and tossing a chill through the narrow alley behind the laboratory. The girl, crouched low among glass jars and scattered powders, smelled rain on brick and the faint metallic scent of spilled chemicals. She had changed the labels on her most potent compounds, scribbling false names, hiding her intentions in plain sight. Every step she took echoed a delicate dance between discovery and disaster. Why should you care? Because the intelligence hiding in that small figure could have rewritten the rules of science or ended in ruin. The man outside the window, a visiting scholar from New Orleans, paused, peering in. He noted the smoke curling from the burner and the faint shimmer of suspended crystals. "What are you working on?" he asked, voice trembling with curiosity and authority. The girl lifted her eyes, careful not to betray fear. "Just cleaning," she said, a half-truth, sufficient for now. Her mind was already 10 steps ahead. She noted his posture, his hand hovering near a cane, and the subtle ways the room shifted under his gaze. Observers rarely appreciated precision. They were drawn to spectacle, not nuance. She had spent years learning to appear small, compliant, even forgettable, while orchestrating experiments that defied everything the textbooks claimed she could do. The laboratory itself held secrets. Stale air thickened with chemical residue, wood warped from decades of humidity, and floors dusted with fragments of glass whispered of past accidents. The smell of sulfur lingered faintly, mixing with the tang of copper and faint mildew. Every container, every paper, every shadow carried lessons. Do not underestimate what the world refuses to name. The visitor, unaware of the subtle traps embedded in her work, leaned closer. She motioned toward a jar of harmless salt, the actual lethal compound concealed beneath layers of decoy containers. The misdirection was second nature. She could have been 12, but her understanding of risk and misperception was decades beyond her age. The neighborhood had grown used to the girl's presence. Footsteps clattered past the lab, children shouted in the alleys, a cartwheel spun by the muddy street. No one paused to question the flashes of light behind cracked windows, Would you intervene if you suspected genius or danger lurking behind closed doors? By midnight, she had completed a series of micro-reactions that tested her theories of absorption and catalysis. Each trial produced tiny shocks, minor explosions, or unexpected glows, none harmful beyond the immediate experiment. Yet they were monumental steps toward her goal, understanding the unseen forces of chemistry that could influence the living world in ways no adult dared imagine. A brief excerpt from her journal, February 19th, 1879. Observation: when compound X contacts compound Y, reaction occurs faster than predicted. Timing critical. Human factor irrelevant unless interference occurs. Must safeguard. Must continue. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but anticipation. She understood that every experiment was a message to herself. I exist. I understand. I will not be named, but I will be remembered. By the third week of February, she had begun communicating with other hidden minds in the city. Women and children who had been dismissed, ignored, or told to play with dolls while men dictated the world. She shared ideas subtly, leaving coded observations in borrowed books under the guise of ordinary annotations. A mark here, a small chemical symbol there. If anyone noticed, it would appear trivial. But she knew her audience. The scholar lingered too long. He would return again, unknowingly leaving traces of his visit. Fingerprints on her notes, misaligned papers, questions that might eventually lead investigators to her. But she was prepared. She had developed a system of redundancies, hiding critical information behind layers of decoys. Each step designed to teach anyone following that discovery was never straightforward. Outside, a storm broke, drumming rain onto corrugated tin and sloshing along the muddy streets. The sounds of the city seemed distant, as though the laboratory existed in a separate dimension, a world governed by rules of reaction, timing, and observation. She closed her eyes, inhaling the ozone-rich air, and whispered a vow she had repeated countless times. I will see it through. No one else can. In the following days, the girl's work attracted subtle attention from the city's scientific circle. Notices appeared in local newspapers about a prodigious mind experimenting beyond conventional study. Editors wrote cautiously, Mississippi youth shows uncommon aptitude in laboratory sciences. Further study recommended. They noted her existence without truly naming her. It was both acknowledgement and erasure, a paradox she had long learned to manipulate. By March, she had perfected a method to distill compounds in a way that maximized potency while remaining undetectable to casual observers. Her next goal: apply her discoveries in a way that could protect those dismissed by society. A silent rebellion conducted with flasks, powders, and a mind honed for secrecy. And yet, questions lingered. Could she remain invisible forever? Would curiosity or greed expose her brilliance before she could act? The boundaries between recognition and danger were thinning. A sudden knock at the back door startled her. It was a neighbor, a man she had never trusted fully, but one whose erratic tendencies were known to the block. Evening, he said, voice casual, almost too casual. Heard some things. Curious, that's all. Her pulse quickened, but her demeanor remained calm, practiced. She smiled politely, gesturing toward the stove. Just heating water. The man lingered a moment, sniffing the faint sulfur in the air, then departed, leaving a tension that would echo in her mind for hours. Every encounter could be pivotal. Every observation might become evidence. Late that night, she added final notes to her journal. The experiment proceeds. Success measured not by observation, but by survival. Those who do not see are blind. Those who see will not understand. The world may never name me, but knowledge cannot be hidden. The rain ceased, leaving streets slick and reflective. Lamplight flickered through windows, casting shadows that shifted like living specters. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the late hour. The girl looked out at the quiet streets, her mind already moving forward, calculating her next steps in a city unaware of her presence, unaware that history was already beginning to bend toward her. What would she risk next? And who might be watching, even now? Secrets in the shadows. The air in Vicksburg was thick with the smell of soot, sweat, and the tang of the Mississippi River in March of 1879. Wooden docks creaked under the weight of passing merchants. Street vendors shouted over the roar of steam engines. Amid this chaos, the girl slipped through alleyways like a shadow, her satchel heavy with jars, papers, and a notebook that contained the blueprint of her invisible life. Each step splashed through puddles and mud, her shoes carrying the damp chill of dawn on cobblestones. Why care? Because in her hands, seemingly harmless substances had the power to rewrite who was safe and who was not. She paused at a narrow passage where 3 men lingered, discussing the recent chemical experiments reported in newspapers. "Remarkable for someone so young," one said, voice tight with envy and suspicion. The girl crouched in a shadow, listening. Their casual chatter revealed her first clue. A teacher at the local academy had begun to mentor promising youth in science, including those usually ignored. Someone, somewhere, was leaving a trail for her to follow, or perhaps a trap. Her narrative core today was not the chemicals themselves, but the people who helped maintain her invisibility. For every street she navigated, for every shipment of reagents she received from distant cities, there was a network. Women who cleaned the academy at night, young boys who delivered messages under the pretense of errands, a widowed herbalist who stored her powders in jars marked dried herbs, all of them risking far more than she ever disclosed. They knew her skill was extraordinary, but even more, they knew it had purpose. One evening, as she crossed the city near a blacksmith's forge, she overheard a common question that would haunt her. Why would anyone hide talent? What would you do if the world refused to acknowledge your brilliance, yet expected obedience? Her answer was simple. Survive, adapt, strike only when necessary. By April, she had developed a system of codes, marking books, journals, and even casual notes in ways that only the initiated could interpret. Each mark was subtle. A slight curl in a letter, a symbol tucked into the margin, or an extra dot above an I. It was enough for her allies to know she had moved safely from one part of the city to another. But if discovered by the wrong hands, these signs could serve as chains rather than keys. In her notebook, an entry dated April 3, 1879. Connection established. Keep all deliveries under observation. Observer notices nothing, yet presence detected. Patience, timing, precision. These are shields. Bystanders continued to enable her, unwittingly or willingly. A carriage driver allowed her to hide beneath a tarp of hay, muffling the soft clink of glass jars. A baker left the back door open, unaware that the satchel in her hand contained compounds she was testing for stability and reaction rates. At each turn, she asked herself, how many eyes see without truly seeing? How many hands could betray without knowing? The girl's work had begun to attract subtle curiosity from those in positions of authority. Letters were circulated quietly among city scholars, noting experiments on absorption and chemical interactions. Observers praised her ingenuity without naming her, commenting on the miraculous achievements of an unknown youth. Such acclaim was a paradoxical gift, recognition without exposure. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit rooms of the herbalist shop, she perfected micro-reactions that could stabilize delicate substances for long transport. Each trial honed her skills in observation, patience, and concealment. Every failure was documented meticulously, a lesson carved into the margins of her mind. These reactions were not dangerous in isolation, but together They represented a mastery she knew would astonish or terrify any who discovered the full scope of her work. She began to understand the rhythms of Vicksburg. Delivery carts creaked at predictable intervals. Children played in alleys at exact times, blocking or revealing her path as needed. Markets emptied at noon, leaving passages she could traverse without witness. Observation of her environment became a science of its own. Knowing when to appear and when to vanish was as vital as any chemical equation. A mid-April journal note, lesson: the city is a crucible. Every observer, whether hostile or indifferent, tests your resolve. One slip could undo years of careful planning. Then came a moment of dangerous serendipity. She discovered a rival observer, a local apothecary, who had begun cataloging unusual shipments. His ledger recorded quantities that matched hers, noting peculiar stability in compounds meant for experimentation. The girl noted his handwriting, the subtle curvature of letters, and began planning contingencies. She could not yet confront him, but she could anticipate every move. A street vendor's cart overturned nearby, sending oranges rolling across wet cobblestones. People laughed, scooped up fruit, oblivious to the tension that coursed through the alleys. The girl paused, heart pounding, and whispered to herself, "The world does not see what it cannot name. The risk is ours, not theirs." By late April, she had linked her chemical knowledge with intelligence gathering. She used decoys, false labels, and deliberately misleading notes to misdirect anyone who might follow her work. Her allies within the city knew to report anomalies only through coded channels. Every shipment, every interaction, every observation reinforced a delicate ecosystem of survival and secrecy. But the stakes remained high. Rumors circulated of a girl experimenting beyond permitted bounds. Her name was whispered in hushed tones, curiosity mingling with fear. Who would report her first? A jealous peer? An envious scholar? Or the indifferent authorities who only needed an excuse to intervene? Finally, one evening, as the sun bled orange across the river, she slipped into the shadowed back room of the herbalist's shop. The scent of dried flowers and old wood enveloped her. She placed her jars on the worn table, consulting her notebook one last time before stepping outside into the misty twilight. The city hummed with ordinary life, unaware of the extraordinary mind weaving its web among them. The re-engagement loop. Would her hidden network survive scrutiny, or would the curiosity of strangers finally unravel everything she had built? She paused at the edge of the river, watching the water reflect the pale moonlight. One choice lay before her: retreat or advance into the unknown. A ripple in the darkness. Dawn broke over Jackson, Mississippi on May 6, 1879, carrying the scent of wet earth, baking bread, and a faint tang of metal from the railroad yards. The girl moved along the river's edge, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, the echo of ferries clanging against pilings in the distance. In her satchel, carefully wrapped glass vials rattled against one another. Each carried the potential for discovery or disguised medicine masquerading as poison, poison hidden as medicine. Why does it matter? Because her experiments were more than chemicals. They were survival, rebellion, and the invisible language of resistance. Her narrative core today was the small laboratory she had set up in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The space smelled of cedar shavings, vinegar, and damp stone. A thin layer of dust covered the wooden work tables, but the girl had scrubbed precise sections where her powders and flasks were arranged by type, reaction, and shelf life. She labeled each batch with codes only her allies could read. The symbols were subtle: an X crossed by a small arc, a dot above a number, a line that curved differently depending on acidity or potency. Her assistant, a young boy named Elias, brought in water from the river. His hands trembled slightly, though he had been trained to steady them. "Miss," he whispered, "they're talking again about the girl who teaches science in secret." She looked up, expression calm. Let them talk. Curiosity can be a shield as well as a threat. The girl's experiments now combined the theoretical with the practical. A drop of this compound might reveal acidity changes over hours. Another could neutralize reaction entirely. In her notes, she cross-referenced formulas for medicinal use, disguised as home remedies. The genius of her approach lay not only in the chemistry, but in her ability to mask it within domestic life: teas, tinctures, even foods. Outside the warehouse, life went on, indifferent. Laundry hung limp on lines, children chased one another across muddy streets, a woman scolded a goat that had wandered into a garden. What would you do if extraordinary science happened in plain sight, yet no one saw it? The bystanders enabled her experiments by their habitual blindness. Their indifference became her ally. Her journal, May 6, 1879, Test Batch C. Observe absorption rate. If disrupted, no trace remains. Only those trained may see truth behind ordinary objects. But there was risk. A rival teacher, known for meticulous record-keeping, had begun frequenting the warehouse district, asking questions that seemed innocent but were calculated. The girl had anticipated this. She had set up decoy experiments and misleading notes to throw off observation. Anyone uninitiated would only see ordinary herbs and powders, but she knew the exact moments when someone would glance at the wrong table, misreading the symbols entirely. By mid-morning, she had finished her latest series of trials. Each compound had been tested, recorded, and stored. The room smelled faintly of charred wood and vinegar. Light slanted through a crack in the roof, catching dust in golden streams. She paused to observe the reactions, scribbling notes about inconsistencies, temperature variations, and subtle color shifts. The girl's system relied on a network, silent but precise. A young laundress across town had instructions to leave a small signal on the front door if authorities were approaching. A baker would deliver a note under the guise of a bread order. All of these allies, strangers to one another, were part of an unspoken web, and it was growing. Each new helper recruited for discretion, not admiration. An incident in late May highlighted the tension. A merchant accidentally dropped a ledger near her workstation. In it, quantities of reagents were meticulously logged. She had to act quickly, substituting notes and creating false measurements to protect herself and the network. Every mistake in the ledger could have unraveled months of careful planning. The girl paused, considering the precarious balance between discovery and invisibility. The world outside would not forgive mistakes. One misstep could mean exposure, incarceration, or worse. Yet she pressed on, driven by the possibility of understanding, the pursuit of mastery that no law, no societal expectation could curtail. She tested a new method for stabilizing a reactive powder in small containers, experimenting with temperature, pressure, and air exposure. One miscalculation could have resulted in a small explosion, alerting neighbors and authorities alike. Instead, the experiment succeeded. Each vial now stable, concealed in plain sight, ready for use if ever required. The city, meanwhile, had begun murmuring about her. Gossip spread of a young girl performing secret experiments, unseen but effective. Could it be true? Was the rumor exaggerated? These whispers became both protection and threat. Allies would identify false leads, and rivals might hesitate, believing the danger greater than reality. By late afternoon, she had finished her primary tests and was preparing to leave the warehouse. The smell of vinegar lingered in her hair. She paused at the doorway, looking out over the river. Its waters were brown and swift, carrying debris from upriver, indifferent to the urgency of human plans. A passerby commented on the girl's focused expression. "She looks like someone who knows secrets," they said. The girl merely nodded, fading into the bustle of the streets. Re-engagement loop. How long could she maintain this balance between invisibility and discovery before the city's curiosity became a threat she couldn't outpace? Cliffhanger close. As she disappeared into Jackson's morning traffic, a shadowy figure followed at a distance, notebook in hand, documenting every subtle gesture, every calculated movement. The classroom smelled of chalk dust, wet wool from aprons, and the faint tang of iron from the heater. It was June 2nd, 1879, in a small building on the outskirts of Vicksburg. The girl stood at the front, measuring liquids into beakers, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. Outside, cicadas droned insistently. The wood floor beneath her feet creaked with every motion. The air was heavy with anticipation, the faint buzz of conversation from students filling the spaces between her words. Why should you care? Because what she was teaching was forbidden lessons, not sanctioned by the state, lessons that blurred the line between science and rebellion. Her narrative core centered on the students, children of freed and enslaved families, gathered quietly around benches, their eyes wide with curiosity and awe. She demonstrated reactions with powders that fumed lightly, liquids that changed color with a drop or a stir, all under the guise of harmless chemistry. Yet each demonstration contained layers of strategy. She trained them to observe with precision, to record notes and ciphers, to question without exposing themselves. Every test was a survival skill, masquerading as education. A sudden knock at the door startled the children. One of the girls' eyes flicked toward it. A local inspector had arrived unannounced, ostensibly checking the building's structural integrity, but known to inquire subtly about the lessons being taught. The children held their breath, pencils frozen over paper. "What exactly are you teaching these children?" the inspector asked, voice polite but edged with suspicion. "Merely science, sir," the girl replied evenly, adjusting a vial so it reflected sunlight and appeared harmless. Observation, measurement, basic principles. Her calm demeanor belied the calculation behind her words. She had anticipated every question, every possible angle. As the inspector glanced over the tables, a faint trail of powdered chalk had been deliberately scattered, masking the true experiments. The students looked on silently, understanding the silent signals she had trained them to recognize. When to nod, when to remain still, when to look away. The inspector lingered, then shrugged, muttering about the unpredictability of youthful attention, and departed. The girl allowed herself a quiet exhale once the door closed. "Well done," she whispered, addressing the children. Curiosity without caution is as dangerous as ignorance itself. A brief primary source excerpt from her journal, June 2nd, 1879. Every child taught a cipher today. Eyes remember what lips must not speak. A network grows in silence. Later, she moved among the benches, checking notes, correcting formulas, guiding fingers along glass surfaces to feel temperature changes and residue. Each child absorbed the lessons differently, but all were learning the same underlying truth. Knowledge could be a weapon, if wielded with discretion. Outside, the city moved in oblivion. Market calls, the clatter of horse hooves, and the smell of fresh bread mixing with river air. Yet beneath this normalcy, her experiments were taking root, embedding patterns of observation and reasoning that would endure long after she was gone. What would you do if forbidden knowledge was passed to the next generation? Would you protect it, destroy it, or exploit it? By late afternoon, she concluded the session, allowing the children to leave, one by one, giving small but precise instructions on what to observe until the next class. She packed her satchel, double-checked her hidden powders, and prepared to move to her next safe house. The precision of her routines, the predictability of her steps, was part of her camouflage. A neighbor, observing from across the street, commented on her calm efficiency. "She walks as if she owns the world, though she is barely seen," they murmured. Indeed, the girl's presence seemed to command space without demanding attention. She moved through streets, marketplaces, and boarding houses, like a shadow, unseen but impactful, leaving traces of knowledge in every corner she touched. Later that evening, she paused beside the Mississippi, watching the water swirl with brown currents, her reflection fragmented in the shifting waves, reminding her of the duality she navigated: teacher and fugitive, scientist and strategist, motherless girl and mentor to the next generation. She sketched notes on small slips of paper: chemical reactions, signals, pathways to safety. These were maps not just of chemistry, but of survival. Re-engagement loop. Could a single person's knowledge, taught quietly, ripple outward to challenge the structures that sought to suppress it? Could a child's understanding protect more than themselves? Cliffhanger close. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a familiar shadow lingered at the edge of the classroom window. Someone who had been tracking her movements for months, waiting for the precise moment to intervene. The streets of Vicksburg at dawn smelled of damp earth, baked clay, and the faint acrid tang of coal smoke. It was June 5, 1879. The girl moved quietly through the alleys, her skirts brushing wet cobblestones slicked by an early morning drizzle. Each footfall was deliberate, measured, designed to leave no trace. Above, shutters rattled in the wind, and somewhere nearby, a dog barked at nothing. Every sense was alert. She wasn't just walking, she was listening, cataloging, calculating escape routes. Why should you care? Because at this very moment, someone had been shadowing her, tracking every movement, every transaction, every whispered lesson. And this pursuit wasn't just about curiosity, it was about control, about silencing knowledge before it could change the balance of power. Her narrative core begins with the Watcher, a man known as Lieutenant Corbin, hired by local authorities under the guise of maintaining order. Corbin had traced her from New Orleans, following coded letters, observed patterns in supply purchases, and reports from neighbors, too timid or too complicit to speak the full truth. Each report added another piece to the puzzle. He knew she taught children. He knew she experimented. And he believed knowledge was as dangerous as any weapon. Through a narrow doorway, she slipped into a boarding house, the smell of damp wood and stale tobacco filling her senses. Inside, the women running the establishment whispered in the kitchen, peeling beans and washing linens, watching the girl as if she were a phantom. They knew she carried secrets heavier than her satchel, yet they offered no betrayal. Bystanders had choices every day, and they often chose silence over interference. What would you do if hiding someone could risk your life, or if speaking could condemn your neighbors? Inside, she set a small table with ingredients for a demonstration, mixing powders that smelled faintly metallic, liquids that shone in muted sunlight, all under the guise of preparing a medicinal tonic. Her hands moved with precision. Her mind traced contingencies like a cartographer of escape. Each reaction taught more than chemistry. It taught observation, patience, the weight of decisions. Corbin arrived at the street outside, noting her disappearance from his vantage point, the window revealing only a glimpse of her bent posture and the glint of metal in her satchel. He recorded the details meticulously: a habit of checking pockets, the careful placement of her satchel under a chair, a tendency to pause and glance at shadows. "She's careful," he muttered. "Too careful." A brief primary source excerpt from Corbin's journal, June 5, 1879. Observed girl at boarding house window. Satchel always within reach. I fear her intelligence outweighs my authority. As she packed her materials to move again, a young boy from the neighborhood approached. He had been one of her students, recognizing the patterns in her movements, offering small diversions for her exit. With a nod, she acknowledged him silently. Networks existed in whispers and gestures, invisible to those who refused to see. By midday, she emerged into the sunlight, navigating back streets toward the river. The Mississippi, brown and swollen from spring rains, stretched like a barrier between control and freedom. She paused, scanning the docks, noting ferries, the movement of cargo, the positions of guards and dockhands. Each observation formed part of a mental map, a matrix of timing and risk that only she fully understood. Re-engagement loop. How far would someone go to protect forbidden knowledge, and how far would pursuers go to snuff it out? Could intelligence survive in a world built on fear and silence? The girl turned a corner sharply, disappearing into a market square crowded with farmers, merchants, and children. Among the throng, Corbin's eyes searched, but she blended seamlessly with the crowd. And yet, she felt the weight of the chase pressing closer, each step monitored, each breath accounted for. Cliffhanger close. That evening, when she settled in a safe house along the riverbank, a note slid under her door. In careful, unmistakable handwriting, it read, "We know what you teach. We are coming." The Ohio River carried the scent of wet timber, coal smoke, and muddy water, as if the land itself remembered every secret ever passed along its banks. August 21st, 1879. Fog hung low, wrapping the riverfront in a blanket that blurred reality and rumor. She moved quietly along the wharf, boots clicking against damp planks, eyes scanning every shadow. Each step was a negotiation with danger, each breath a calculated risk. Why should you care? Because what she carried wasn't just knowledge, it was proof that a single mind could challenge decades of fear, superstition, and rigid authority. What she knew threatened those who believed control came from ignorance. Her narrative core begins with her arrival at a warehouse converted into a makeshift school, a haven where she could teach without interference. The place smelled of ink, wet wood, and powdered chalk. Inside, boys and girls huddled around rough wooden desks, learning letters and numbers under her careful guidance. She demonstrated experiments with liquids that fizzed and powders that changed color. Every lesson a carefully disguised exercise in observation and critical thinking. Yet danger was never far. Across the river, men paid by local authorities monitored the wharfs, noting patterns in the girls and boys who arrived, the adults who carried satchels, and the odd smell of chemicals that betrayed unusual activity. Among them was Corbin, persistent, methodical, tracing every movement from Mississippi through Louisiana and Tennessee to Ohio. He believed in method, in handwriting analysis, in observation over chance, and he thought her finally trapped. A young girl handed her a folded note, a warning. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but the message was clear. They are closer than you think. Do not linger. She tucked it inside her bodice, smiling faintly at the child. Networks like hers relied on small interventions, invisible to the untrained eye. What would you do if you had to trust strangers with your life every day? By late afternoon, she prepared for the next move, a ferry across the river that could take her north, into states where authorities had less reach. The river, wide and indifferent, surged against the docks with a low, constant roar. Cargo boats groaned under weight, and gulls wheeled above, crying. Every sensory detail became a navigational tool, how the rope swayed, how the fog shifted, how distant shouts carried. Re-engagement loop. Could someone truly escape a pursuit that followed them from state to state, tracing letters, purchases, and whispers? How long before the hunter and hunted collided? She reached the ferry just as the sun broke through the fog, casting golden streaks across the water. Boarding quietly, she kept her satchel close, her hands moving deliberately to keep its contents hidden. The ferryman, accustomed to the movement of strangers, said nothing. Others on the deck were preoccupied with the river and their work. The momentary anonymity gave her a slender advantage. Cliffhanger close. Yet as the ferry slipped from the dock, A sharp whistle pierced the morning air. On the shore, a man waved a folded paper, eyes locked on her face. Corbin had found her again, and this time, the river would not shield her. Morning light shimmered across the Ohio River, mixing with mist and the faint aroma of coal smoke, river mud, and wet wood. August 22nd, 1879. Clara, or Adoni, as she now allowed herself to think, stood on the ferry's edge, the water churning beneath her like the heartbeat of a city that had watched too many secrets pass. Her satchel pressed against her side contained not just letters and ledgers, but years of survival, evidence, and carefully honed intelligence. Why should you care? Because what happens next would decide not only her fate, but the survival of knowledge, of lineage, and the hidden truths that authorities had fought to erase. Her narrative core, every step of her escape, had been planned with the precision of someone who understood that visibility was danger. Across the river, the dock swarmed with men who had trailed her for months, their persistence finally converging at this one location. Corbin, the meticulous tracker, had followed her letters, her forged receipts, her subtle patterns in handwriting that betrayed her presence more than any witness ever could. He was close enough to identify the unique curl of her G, the twist of a flour sack tied under her arm. Clara glanced at the river, its brown waters moving fast, relentless, unjudging. She remembered the faces of her daughters, Patience and Grace, learning in a Quaker school north of Lake Erie, alive and free because she had endured, because she had chosen calculated risk over immediate surrender. The thought steadied her hands as she opened her satchel, removing a small vial, its contents a reminder of the power she wielded. One dose, one swallow, one declaration of autonomy. The ferry docked, and men began to shout. The river seemed to echo their calls, adding weight to the pursuit. Bystanders, dock workers, and early commuters paused, unsure whether to intervene or ignore the unfolding drama. What would you do? Watching a woman confront decades of injustice with a vial in her hand and defiance in her eyes, Clara's feet moved deliberately along the gangplank, past the clatter of chains and cargo, toward a narrow escape route only she had scouted in advance. She leapt to a small skiff tethered nearby, the wooden boards slick with mist. Corbin's shout rang out again, cutting through the morning fog. She paddled hard, muscles straining, steering into a weave of river channels only she had memorized. The Ohio swallowed her trail, turning her escape into a liquid puzzle, a map invisible to those who relied solely on observation and rigid logic. Re-engagement loop. Could someone outrun pursuit not just by speed, but by understanding the river, the fog, and the silence between human words? Could knowledge be more lethal than brute force? Hours later, Clara reached the northern bank, stepping onto land that felt different, open, yet cautiously observed. She discarded the heavy satchel, keeping only letters that mapped her daughter's whereabouts. She let the river hide the rest. In this quiet moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to remember the first time she had tasted freedom and the lessons learned along the way. How to read danger, manipulate perception, and turn knowledge into survival. Cliffhanger close. By autumn, sightings of a woman matching her description rippled through towns along the Great Lakes. And in Chicago, a boarding house kitchen smelled of onions, coal smoke, and possibility. Was she truly gone? Or had she simply transformed into someone untraceable, waiting to pass her knowledge to the next generation? Present-day rumor tag. Some say a gloved woman still walks Chicago kitchens, teaching survival disguised as recipes. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.